This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
We are seeing a sustained 100,000, at least for Category B. And for Category A, which is for the masses, approaching 100,000. I think this is not really in any way a good thing. I mean, it's great for government revenue, of course, which is used by everybody, drivers and non-drivers alike. But it doesn't do any good for business cost of living. The LTA is not wrong when it says that it's really supply and demand. But that is like saying, when you have dark clouds, it will rain. Or when it rains, the ground gets wet. It's not wrong. But there are a lot of things that go in between supply and demand. There are a lot of things going on. And you have to fix things which are not so right in between supply and demand.
Welcome to a special episode of COE Watch. It's special because I'm chatting with an absolute authority when it comes to COE and transport at large. And he happens to be my colleague here at the Straits Times. His time reporting on the subject predates Singapore's first MRT line. Actually, he started even before the formation of the Land Transport Authority. He also knows quite a bit about cars, having been reviewing all the latest cool wheels for literally decades. So join me in my conversation with Christopher Tan, Senior Transport Correspondent here at the Straits Times. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Lee Nian Tjoe.
Hey, let's cut to the chase. At events, press conferences, and business leaders, car company heads, and even some government officials will speak in hushed tones when you enter the room. I want to know, what is so scary about Christopher Tan?
I'm not sure that's even true. I must say that I do enter press conference with a list of questions because I do my homework and I have a list of questions to ask. Not all of them are easy to answer because I delve deeply into the subject. And when they deliver their speeches or whatever, I do pick out things that are not so consistent and I bring those up. And maybe it makes people a bit uneasy. But at the end of the day, what I do serve, and I always keep that in mind, is the reader. I mean, the reader pays us at that point in time 60 cents. Today, a little over $1 per copy of your Straits Times. I want to deliver value. So at the end of the day, I want to give them not just the news, but so what? The big question about what is this news about, how relevant it is to me. So it is with this premise that I do enter whatever event that I'm attending, whether be it a press conference or a motor show or a product unveiling. So I do have questions and people have learned to deal with that, most of them at least. But those who are not prepared may find it a bit uncomfortable. But life goes on.
Do you think that in that case, it's a case of even, say, off-the-cuff comments or what we often say, hey, this is off the record, Chris? Will it also make onto the record?
If it is off the record, I will definitely try and persuade him to say why should it be off the record. I think in the old days, when I first started, I think people were a bit more candid than now. I think now it's a bit more manicured. I would say I use the polite term. Back then, people were more honest, shoot from the hips, and they don't always have a comms department. They don't always have scripted answers, and what they say are usually the truth. And very, very seldom people will tell you off the record. Very seldom. But today, almost everything is off the record until you persuade them that it shouldn't be off the record.
And what if they don't agree?
If they don't agree, I will write it in such a way that doesn't put them in a spot, but I will still deliver the news. I will still deliver the information, and I'll still deliver whatever commentary that I will write later on based on whatever off-the-record comments they have.
So the key point really comes back to answering that so what? Like, why does this thing that's been announced, why does it matter? So what, right? For the rest of us on the other side of the fence, being readers or listeners or viewers.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to cut this down for our conversation to focus on these two things that you do, right? Besides doing transport, you're also into motoring. I think we'll start with motoring first because I think that's the fun stuff. With motoring, there's all this coverage with car reviews, all really the exciting things. So here we want to go back to the 80s or even earlier in asking, what was your first car review?
Oh, that's easy. My first car that I wrote about was the Nissan 200SX. It's a nice little two-door coupe, sporty.
With the pop-up lights or?
with the pop-up lights.
Ah,
That was cool. Now, to put things into context, I was not even a driver back then. I was a motorcyclist. Yeah.
okay.
I've been riding bikes for several years. And, when you ride a bike, you are into mechanical things. And naturally that, 2 wheels, 4 wheels, they're the same. And the 200SX happens to be my first car. I remember it was rather embarrassing because I would focus on the wheel cover. Back then it was not alloy
wheel
wheels.
caps, yeah.
Wheel caps, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would focus on the design and kind of make comments on it. And I got a earful from the distributor, which was Dan Chong, and there was a lot of snide remarks, but you learn. I mean, there's a first time for everything. You make mistakes, you learn from them. And over the years, I have, gathered a lot of information and a lot of experience. But there has to be that first step. And the Nissan 200SX was my first step.
I see. So, any idea now, I mean, this has been 100 years. How many cars have you actually reviewed or driven?
Yeah, I mean, people have asked me that, and I reckon about 3,000 or so, or slightly more over 30 years.
And these will be 3,000 different cars, right? As in, you don't go back to the same car and drive it twice, usually.
I mean, to be fair, it includes some variants. For instance, a saloon version, and then followed by a wagon, followed by a hatch, or something with a 2 liter, and then later with a 2.5. Variants, they include everything.
So, in other words, you probably have this sixth sense to get a sense of the car when you approach a car. Do you get hey, this one I think I got good feeling, good vibes, and then this one I'm not so sure. How quickly before you quickly can get the impression, that kind of a judgment on a car?
I wouldn't call it sixth sense, but like I said, over the years I've driven a lot of cars, and the experience that comes with it, you have a lot of reference points. So, things that are done and people say this is the first, say no, not really. I've driven something like that before. And this feature is the first, then you say no. And I mean, this kind of experience can only come with time and investment that you put into the profession. Yeah, I mean, cars are actually a compromise. The amalgamation of many considerations like space, comfort, sportiness, efficiency, styling, and then cost. And the car makers try to put them all together with some emphasis on one thing to try and sell that point. But really, I mean, cars are for every day, right? Every day. And very seldom you will have an all-out sports car. There are those, but very often the sporty cars are the cars that will still allow you to drive day to day.
So you always go approaching from that daily motorist sort of angle.
Yeah, I think I always drive the car like I drive my own car. I don't really do a lot of fancy antiques. I mean, you can't do that in Singapore anyway. And you drive like you would normally, and you pick out the things, the inconsistencies of the chassis, for instance, the way it goes over the humps, it goes over not so even roads. So the noise, right? I mean, it used to be that cabin rattle was a big thing, but now all the cars are pretty well made. I mean, their quality is very much higher than they were, let's say, even 20 years ago.
So do you think that this part of the job of reviewing a car, right? When you say, I want to get a bit more into the details in terms of you're normally driving. Are you somebody say, let's take a car, you use the car to go on date nights, for example, or you need to do running errands and I don't know, you fill it up with gardening tools. What kind of things do you do with these cars as part of this daily drive that you're talking about?
Everything. I will try, for instance, I will try the boot space. Now I will
do you climb into it or you put somebody inside?
I'll put a 4D inside.
Okay.
I'll put my 4D bike and see how it fits. Right? If it's able to fit easily, then I'll say that bigger than usual. Sometimes they will give you the literage of a boot. Now the literage of a boot really measures right from the floor right up to the ceiling.
Yes.
And most of us don't fill up our boot that way. So it's really the space, how square it is, how flat it is, whether there are intrusions that come into the boot that prevents you from loading up awkward, long, bulky objects. So, one of my predecessors would actually use his golf set to put in and see how well it fits. I use a 4D. And that way I can judge in an instant how, commodious this boot is compared to other cars. And I sit in the back as well. I try to sit at the back because a car sometimes is engineered for the driver And then he may feel very nice at the wheel, driving it, but the passengers at the back may not feel that way. So I try to sit at the back as well to see how the space is, headroom, hip room, leg room, and also how you feel when the car is moving.
Now, so far, you seem to be, to cut to it, you sound like you're finding fault with a car. The boot not as big as you say. The rear seats are not that cushy, or, it come across as you don't like cars.
Of course, I like cars. I mean, how the hell do I stick with this profession if I don't like cars? I'm not finding fault. I'm actually picking out things, the strengths as well. Right?
Okay, let's go strengths.
I highlight the strengths as well. Like, I mean, if a car is really sweet, right? It's really sweet. I say so.
What would be really sweet? Like, what are the things that really would tickle your fancy? This is really nice.
I think drivability is one big point.
Okay.
Drivability is a combination of a lot of things, of how the acceleration comes through, whether it's linear, not linear, how the throttle actually response is like. I mean, does it correspond with the engine or the motor when you step on the throttle?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a lot of dead spot. Are there any flat spots in the power curve? Like when it's between 0 to 60, it may be very smooth, but between 60 and 80, it may not be quite linear.
This is when you were driving carburetor cars, right?
It started with those, and then injectors. Of course, everything gets better, like I said. And then now we have EVs.
Yeah.
Right? Now we have EVs. The response is usually flawless.
Instantaneous, right?
Yeah.
So now this thing with EVs. I want to find out, do you think that electric vehicles will take over our roads?
I think in the long term, there will still be a combination. There will still be a combination of EVs, hybrids, and pure combustion engines. Pure combustion engines will probably be a rarity. With collector's items, sports cars, for instance, the larger part of the population will probably be petrol-electric hybrids. There'll be quite a big chunk of it that will be pure electric vehicles. I don't see pure EVs taking up every part of the world. I don't see it happening in any one country because there will be times that you need something more. Like, for instance, I mean, if you look at it, our landscape, the biggest penetration now is cars.
Yes.
You reported that almost 1 in 3 new cars registered is an EV, but what about commercial vehicles? What about heavy goods vehicles? What about buses? And then what about motorcycles, right?
But then still I'm speaking to the motoring reviewer, the motoring expert here. Are you pro EVs, or you are one of those that want to hang on to IC until the last drip of dino juice is used up on this earth?
I'm not a pro anything. I think anything that works well should be on our roads. You can have a small petrol engine that's very efficient, that gives you something like 12, 13 or 15 just per 100 km. That's very good in my books already. Or a hybrid which gives you 20, 25 km per liter. That's also very good. Now, EVs, of course, I think the main proposition of EVs is that they make our urban air a lot cleaner.
That's the localized pollution you're talking about, the tailpipe pollutions.
People will argue that EVs will still ultimately make use of fossil fuels because our generators make use of fossil fuels. But that's really another argument because our power generators are very far from where we live, work and play, whereas cars are close to where we work and play. And you want to have cars that are emission-free if possible, especially buses, the bigger ones that emit a lot of tailpipe emissions. And then imagine if you are standing at the bus stop every day waiting for your ride, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and you're breathing on all the particulate, it's not good for you. So I think for EVs, that is the main proposition. It's not your instant torque, which is nice, for the driver. It's
Bad
not
for the passengers, I tell you.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah. I mean, if you look from a design point of view, I mean, EVs are not really pretty, right? They have compromises because they have that layer of battery below their floor, and therefore you see a chunkiness of the body and the styling. It's never as sweet as an ICE car. So from what you said earlier, whether I love cars or not, I love cars that are beautiful. And EVs don't really, not many of them are beautiful.
Not many pretty EVs out there.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so besides EVs, I know you're kind of deviating or going to that thing that is transport. I want to lock you into motoring still, which is this. Besides, you mentioned buses. Have you driven a bus or other cool things you've driven? I mean, like non-cars. You said that you're a biker. You've driven lots of cars, 3,000 cars. Have you driven a bus, a UFO, aircraft carrier? Where have you been up to in your motoring career?
I've actually driven a truck on a racetrack. I mean, it's a racetrack.
You
but
race a truck.
It's proving ground. I mean,
Okay.
this was courtesy of Daimler, and at that point in time, they had these heavy vehicles for us to drive. It's within a circuit, so you don't need a class 4 or 5.
Okay.
And I remember driving a huge hauler.
So these are those like tractor types where you need to pull a container in the back.
Where the cabin moves independently of the, what you call it, the...
It's
the load
articulated,
carrier.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that I've driven that and tried parking that
unlicensed,
as well.
I should say.
Unlicensed on the track. I've driven an amphibious vehicle.
Okay. Now we're talking.
Which the ST group was trying to sell. And that was interesting because, you could go into water just like that and come out. And I went there in my office gear, not knowing what to expect. And
I see.
you can imagine all wet and, not very glamorous.
So you drove out.
I went out.
Because I think crucially we need to make the distinction that the thing about amphibious vehicles is that you could get in and out of water, because most cars can go into water, you just can't come out.
Right.
Okay, besides
So
that, what else? I'm still waiting for the UFO one.
I drove a hydrogen fuel cell bike that looked like unicycle in reverse.
No.
That was cool because it ran on hydrogen fuel cell, not hydrogen as a fuel. And I think because most memorable experience was flying a helicopter.
Wow. Okay.
So Bell reached out one day and said, we have this helicopter that is targeted at the retail customer. Yeah. And people who would normally have a Rolls Royce or Bentley in their garage.
Yeah.
And this was a Bell, I forget the model now. But of course, I flew with a qualified instructor next to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this was in Singapore?
Yeah, that was in Singapore. That was very nice.
Was this before or after Crazy Rich Asians, the movie?
That was after.
After. So then we can all understand that there's this group of people who lives in the stratosphere who would need something like this.
Actually, it doesn't. I mean, it costs less than, say, top of the line Rolls Royce. It costs less than that.
Oh, okay. I mean, for somebody who already has a top-of-the-line Rolls Royce, you also need to have a helicopter, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Now, of all this whole thing of like this quite a wide range of vehicles, from cars, 3,000 cars, trucks, amphibious vehicles, helicopters, and what have you, what is most memorable? What would be the sweetest for you? The word you use is sweet, right? So what is the sweetest?
Right. I think back in the early days, when I drove the Jaguar XJ, it was a limousine by Jaguar it was back in the day when it was independent. And I think it was a Series 4. I didn't call it a Series 4, but it came after the Series 3. And I remember I could see wires hanging down from the glove box. Quality, of course, wasn't its strong suit, but it had charm. It had lots of charm. It had design. It had comfort. Lots of shiny wood and metal. And you could smell the cabin, which is so like a country club. You just feel very special behind the wheel of such a vehicle, the XJ back then. Quality, of course, what I told you about the wires hanging down. And after that, maybe the next big thing was the Lexus LS 400, which was the first Lexus model. Back then, the Germans like Mercedes and BMW, they ruled that
segment, right? Yeah.
That segment, no one could penetrate it. And then Toyota decided that, okay, we'll start up a division, call it Lexus. Nobody knew what it was. They started with an LS 400, also a limo. And man, that thing took the bar like 2 notches up. It was so quiet. It was so smooth. It was so comfortable. It's unbelievable. Actually, what we heard is that Mercedes bought one and took it apart, bolt by bolt, to see what made it,
What made it not tick? They make the ticking sound, you mean?
Exactly. Yeah. So the LS 400 was also very memorable. And many years later, it was the Lexus LFA. I'm afraid another Lexus that made an impression. LFA was their first all-out sports car. That car remains the fastest car I've driven. Now, when I say fastest, it's not like top speed, but also the way it accelerates. I remember looking at the tachometer, right? The one that counts the revs.
Yep.
And every time it changes gears, the thing does not drop. It maintains. It's really a wild thing, but also in Lexus style, so easy to drive. Yeah. So it made me think of another car I drove back in the 80s, which was the Honda NSX.
That should be the 90s
or maybe not
then.
80s, maybe the 91,
Yeah.
92. That car also was a Japanese supercar going against the Porsche 911, and it was also very easy and very stupendous in the way it delivered performance. It didn't make you work. I mean, all the other cars, sports cars in that era, made you work.
Mm.
And this car, it was as easy to drive as a Civic.
So all these cars you've driven, these memorable cars, did you have to return them?
Unfortunately, yes.
Like you willingly return them, or you, as we say, egg blur when they ask for it back?
Right. So, I mean, the XJ was something that I remember dreaded giving it back.
Mm.
It was so nice, so luxurious. Because now, I mean, after having driven so many
other limousines and stuff.
other limousines, I still think back to that car that made an impression because, despite its flaws, it had that charm. And I think the EVs today are missing that a lot.
Yes. Yeah, actually, that's something I want to ask you, because it seems like you look back, 100% you're looking back. Your most memorable cars, the LFA, if I'm not wrong, it's more than 10 years ago.
Yeah, about 10, 12 years ago.
This is a 10-cylinder, high screaming, like amazing car.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Lexus didn't make a penny out of it. It's a money loser, but it set the bar like this is what we can do, right? But these are all set like decades ago. And nothing from the last couple of years? No EVs.
To be very honest,
very prominently, no EVs.
Okay, EVs. There is one EV, but then again, I cannot say that it is in the past recent years.
Mm-hmm.
One EV made an impression, and it was a Mitsubishi i-MiEV. The Mitsubishi i-MiEV was the first EV that I drove in Singapore extensively. And it was part of the first EV test bed that the government undertook.
Mm.
And this was when Lawrence Wong was head of EMA. And
that guy.
That guy.
I've heard of him.
That guy, yeah.
Same one.
Anyway, it was that time, and the Mitsubishi i-MiEV was a small little hatch, cute as anything, and it was the first modern EV that I drove. Very nice. I mean, the torque was stupendous, the range was horrible, but yeah, because it was the first, it sticks in your mind, and it gives you a foretaste of what is to come. The instant torque.
Yeah.
The handling, because, the battery is below and acts as a ballast, so it handles corners like nothing, even though its shape is nothing like a sports car.
This is a tall and skinny little thing. It looks like a bean, but it's on like little stilts for wheels, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's cool. But unfortunately, Mitsubishi never made it anymore after a short spell. And even though it was one of the first, or if not the first, to come up with something like that, there's nothing no electric models from that brand.
They haven't had a follow through. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to take a break in a bit, but before we do that, right, I think I want to come to a very important piece of knowledge I would like to share with the listener, which is when it comes to cars, what should a layperson be looking out for when they do a test drive? This is assuming that we all should do a test drive. I hope that is the correct recommendation. What should they be looking for if test drive is the way forward?
I think each one of us will look at different things at different stages of our lives. If you're a young man or young woman starting out in your working career, you probably want something affordable, and maybe something a little flashy. And really, I think at that point in time, it's really just the budget. It's really just a budget. But given that budget, there are still a couple of choices.
Okay.
And I remember my very first car, I was tossed between a Hyundai and a Suzuki. And I picked the Suzuki because eventually the design of the car won me over. And a lot of times, design is actually what makes the person go for a car. And subconsciously also what will determine whether he will fork out money for it. Now, beyond design, like I said, the practical things. If you have a family, next stage of a career, you're starting a family, you have a kid along the way, and you want something to be able to fit your car seat at the back. So you don't want something that's too small, too sporty, too low.
Yep.
Right? Now, of course, the boot also has to be quite spacious for your pram and all that. And then later in life, when you're had to have older parents at home who are still living with you, you might want something also a little higher so that the seats are close to your hip point. You don't have to go down and up. Getting in and out is a chore. Now, beyond all these, of course, car reviewers look for things like, the build quality. And one way we judge a car very superficially is to look at the shut lines, the gap between the door panels and how all the panels of the car, how they line up, whether the lines are narrow and consistent. And then we look inside, whether the dashboard, the lines are also consistent, whether there's any, one side is higher and lower or whatever. And basic things like how the door sound when they close, and bits like spoilers, whether how they fit, whether if you flimsy
Press
or
them
not.
a bit for creaks, right?
Yeah, and even windows.
So try every feature there is, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah, I think you have to touch the car, look at the car, put your ears to the ground and listen to the car as well.
And bring a child seat if you so need a child seat, or bring an old person if you need to check the hip point of the car.
It's always good to bring your family members along when you're car shopping because they will give you a different perspective than what you feel at the wheel. Like I said earlier, some cars feel very nice at the wheel but don't feel that great at the back, right?
Then what about this thing with, as you are approaching these cars, is that also the mindset when it eventually turn out to be a review that we see on the weekend papers? That this is what we've done. Like, you've gone through this rigor, because as we're talking, I see there's a lot of hand movements. You're touching the car, you're feeling for panel gaps, you're trying to use your ears, using your senses, and this is conveyed in the car review.
Yes, a lot of it. I like to think that the main difference, or the only difference between my review and a lot of other reviews, is that I actually don't censor that much. I still have to be a little polite because it's a small town. You don't offend people, but that doesn't prevent me from telling the truth. Right? Then I think if you're shopping for a sports car, I think you would want to look at performance. And for those cars, I'll drive it a bit more aggressively, take it through winding roads. I would even put my finger between the door seal and the door and see whether there's any flex. But these are things that normal people don't really care about. But if you are reviewing a sports car, you have to, you're looking at it at the high level.
Different priority, right?
Yes.
Slightly different priority. Okay. So this podcast, at the end of the day, we do call it COE Watch, right? And COE is that one point where motoring meets transport policy, right? And in my short time doing this, and I go, hey, COE premium has been going through the roof. And then later on, we say it's gone through the new roof, and on and on and on, breaking records again and again. And this is for cars, for motorcycles, for commercial vehicles, all vehicle types. So is what we witnessed in 2023 any different from the years before? Here, I'm tapping on your experience here.
Yeah.
Is this normal?
Okay, I mean, we're now into 2024, and we have seen a little softening of the really crazy levels that we saw in the last quarter of 23. And that's largely because the government has, or the LTA has decided to give out a little extra, borrowing from the future and using them now. But you would be right in saying that the COE levels now are at their highest over an extended period. We've had COE reaching 100,000 and maybe breaching them, but those were like blips, moments
It
in
spikes
history.
and then it drops, right?
Yeah. And they were corrected very quickly. But now we are seeing a sustained 100,000, at least for Category B. And for Category A, which is for the masses, approaching 100,000. I think this is not really in any way a good thing. I mean, it's great for government revenue, of course, which is used by everybody, drivers and non-drivers alike.
Yeah.
But it doesn't do any good for business costs, cost of living, and then, of course, people aspiring to own a car. Say what you will, I mean, our public transport system is one of the best in the world, but still, there will be a segment or there'll be a moment in your life that you need or want a car.
So, okay, I hear you. We say that, for those who want a car now, it becomes less affordable. We leave people behind. Business costs, the connection of car or vehicle prices, pushing up business costs, and then eventually
it trickles down.
It trickles down. Yeah. Just as the coffee prices near SPH office has gone up by 10 cents as a public service for everybody, it's gone up.
Right.
But the question then is, well, it's no good, I would say, a fair value judgment. What is driving it? Or does it mean that it's no good, then we need to change, right? What is driving this thing and how can we change it?
Well, the LTA is not wrong when it says that it's really supply and demand. But that is like saying, when you have dark clouds, it will rain. Or when it rains, the ground gets wet. It's not wrong. But there are a lot of things that go in between supply and demand. There are a lot of things going on. And you have to fix things which are not so right in between supply and demand.
Okay.
Right?
Now we're getting interesting. What's not right?
I think in the last few years, we have seen a lot of aggressive bidding from fleet owners. Fleet owners being the private hire operators, for one. And, it is in their interest to, expand their fleet as fast as possible because, the more cars they have, the more hires they have. The more hires they have, the more income they have. And then for people who run car sharing companies. The more cars they have means the more cars they have at more locations. The more locations they have, the more people find that their services are convenient and etc. etc. And they are also able to pass the cost down to the hirer, to the consumer. Because if you break down 100,000 or 120 or 150,000 COE down to daily or hourly rates, it's actually the cost becomes, more amenable. People are able to accept that. So we have that. And then I think of late, electric cars are becoming a contributor to driving prices up. Why I say that is that electric cars qualify for huge and generous rebates, tax rebates.
Yes, over what the combustion engine car gets, right? These are rebates that
a lot more.
Combustion engine do not qualify for.
So a fully electric car qualifies for as much as $45,000 in rebate. Now, what happens is that because the car dealers themselves do like 99.9% of all COE bidding, they are able to, I would say, capitalize on this rebate system and able to use the rebates as bidding ammunition in their pricing. I mean, when they price a car, they have to price it in a way that is competitive, of course. But if you have already $45,000 that is coming to you in the form of a rebate, there are ways to engineer your price in a way that allows you more room to bid, to secure a COE, as opposed to another dealer who does not have $45,000 in the price.
And also here now, this is interesting, this thing with having this chunky rebate is that I've also reported that we've got many new players who are in this game of selling EVs, and everyone else, all these newcomers or existing guys who are switching over to sell EVs also have this level of rebate to play with.
Yes.
Right? So, but now I want to ask you this question is that if ultimately the intention is to get people into EVs, that's not such a bad thing, is it?
So, I mean, everything comes at a cost.
Yes.
If you are able to do it in a way that does not cost an arm and a leg, it's better, right? It's better for everyone.
Whose arm or whose legs?
Well, consumers and all of us. I mean, even the non-driver, as I mentioned and as you agreed earlier, that, coffee prices, food prices, COE, price of a vehicle, price of a van, price of a truck, has a way of filtering down. So it may not be a huge component in the basket, in an inflation basket, but in an environment where everything is going up, property, land prices, utilities, other forms of taxes.
And labor costs.
And labor, not to mention that. Every little thing adds up. You don't want to have something and say, hey, actually, cars are actually a small component in the CPI, right? That's a poor argument, in my opinion. If you can do something that eases up on the inflationary pressure, why not do it?
So how do you ease this inflationary pressure? Because here I want to try an idea with you. We talk about rebates. Oftentimes, I mean, the reality for cars at least, the rebates are given at point of purchase, meaning that the seller will then, I will price this net, I will take away the rebate and say, this is the net value. This is really a huge saving to you, Mr. Tan. As opposed to say, after you register the car, then you get a check from the government, meaning that the dealer is taken out from this equation. What do you think of something like this? This is something that we've seen for commercial vehicles, for example, until the most recent update where they used to give out 30,000, of which 10,000 for every anniversary for the registration. Would something like that work?
Yeah, definitely. I think in other countries where they don't give out direct rebates, they have other ways of incentivizing people. For instance, you're able to drive zero-emission car into the city center at a certain time. Whereas if you drove a diesel or a petrol vehicle, you are only able to go in there maybe late at night or not at all. So these are the stick and carrot measures they have. They can have you have an income tax write-off. So it's later.
Yes.
Right? It's a benefit that comes later, not at the point of sale. At the point of sale, it can be maneuvered by the seller. Right? They can have, for instance, we have this high occupancy vehicle lanes. You can also apply that to EVs if you like. I'm not saying that in Singapore, which is so built up, we're able to do that. But certainly at this point, we have to rethink the rebates. we have to rethink the rebates. It's also costing us in taxes forgone, not forgetting that. Each car, $45,000, right?
But COE 100,000.
Yeah.
Net were all right.
Well, yes. But that one really has a cost. That one really has
Which
a
is
cost.
the man on the street, you and I, who ends up paying more for food and stuff.
Yeah. So is it time to kind of ease off on our rebate? That's also one question that we have to ask. If you look at how the EV companies are actually slashing prices, it makes me think that they are already at parity in terms of cost or very close.
So they are already at capitalizing on incentives. It's not about adoption now, right?
So is it time to kind of pull back on incentives or even do away or maybe, try other means? I mean, of course, the unpopular way would be to make it more punitive to own an ICE car, right? That's also something that needs to be done. Yes, rebates have helped us to put the first few thousand EVs on the road. It has shown to people at large that EVs work and they are appealing in their own way. But at some point, rebates have to be rethought, right? Whether we can go on giving rebates. Ultimately, we are actually subsidizing car buyers. I mean, is that the right way?
That's an uncomfortable realization to arrive at as well.
Yeah,
because if it means that some benefit more than others, and in this case, those who choose EV over, shall we say, a more rudimentary, a more basic vehicle, why not, right? I mean, how come EV buyers get more and the others don't? Now, I get a sense that we're edging towards bigger picture ideas, more than just COE prices being high or low, but about transport policy at large. And this is where our conversation got even more serious, where we discussed the state of public transportation in Singapore. Just what are the gaps? Why are MRT trains still breaking down? And why do Singaporeans complain so much? Oh, and before I forget, there's a big announcement in this part of my conversation with Christopher Tan. To be continued. Well, that's a wrap for COE Watch, a podcast by the Straits Times. I'm your host, Lee Nian Tjoe. If you resonate with the points raised, do share this podcast episode with your friends and family. If you would like to read more of my transport articles, there is a link in the podcast show notes. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.